we're all pressed for time. So good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you to our second webinar of doing math with Paul Armstrong. I'd like to introduce Paul. He has his honors Bachelor of Science and a Bachelor of Education from Brock University with a concentration in geography and history. He has additional qualifications in math, special ed, and guidance and career. Paul has spent most of his teaching career in academic instruction at the Overwhelm Skills and Trades Training Center, located at the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, working with Indigenous adults. There, he has had the opportunity to teach math, science, and a variety of other programs at both the secondary and post-secondary levels. And I've known Paul for a number of years. In fact, he was one of my colleagues when I worked at Great several years ago. And so he's a wonderful teacher, and he's going to share his knowledge of teaching Indigenous adults math. And I know that a lot of people who have benefited from his teaching. So Paul, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thank you, Michelle. Yeah, so the focus of today's webinar is on assisting in overcoming anxiety for adult learners. But beyond that, I'm also just going to share some of my lessons learned, some of the resources I find really useful with math, and not just strictly focusing on anxiety. It's just not the most positive thing to focus on all the time. So yeah, we're doing math. Like Michelle said, my experience. So I'll get to me. So about me, so yeah, I do work at the Overwhelm Skills and Trades Training Center. So that is quite a mouthful. So we use OSTTC as a little quicker reference. So my institute is based on mostly skills programs, professional development, and the skilled trades. So we kind of have a unique setup where a lot of our math training is geared towards further education and further training towards some kind of career. And a lot of the stuff is based on skilled trades. So I may reference that quite a bit through this webinar. That's what I'm most familiar with. So I have had the privilege to teach Indigenous adults for over 10 years now. So I do know Michelle from before Michelle worked at Great. And I have taught quite a few students now from a variety of ability levels. So all the way from very basic elementary math up to students going off to high-level university courses. So our school, we offer a couple of different offerings. I'll just give you a background for it. GED, which I'm sure most people are somewhat familiar with. So that's for, I'll get into the students that we use that for, but that's an option. My other main focus is what we call academic upgrading. So it started with just the grade 12 math and physics when I became a teacher here. And that was to get people ready for the trades or post-secondary. But throughout the years, we've discovered that there's been a bit of a lack of math skills. So that became too difficult for a lot of our incoming students. So we had to shift focus to a little bit earlier on, a little more fundamental math. And we introduced the grade 11 math. And then actually before that, we now do the math basics. So the math basics program is something I've created where it's more individual based. It can sometimes be done in a class as well, but it goes right back to the fundamentals. We'll talk about it a little bit more, but we found a lot of students don't have the fundamental skills in the math to become successful in the higher levels. It's not that they can't learn that material and they don't have the ability, it's just they don't have those foundational knowledge to really build off of. So we started doing a math basics program, which sometimes goes for a month, every day, all day. So it's very intensive, but we try to gear it towards the needs of the students and what their skill level is like. So yeah, I do want to share some of my lessons learned. It's been a really good experience working here, and getting to work with adults is also a bonus. People always ask me if I'd go back to teaching high school or younger students, and I love the adult education side of it. Throughout this webinar as well, if you do want to ask any questions, you can put those in the chat, and we'll try and get to those as we go along. So just some common challenges and concerns that I have kind of learned along the way. So first thing is I've noticed a major, well, not major, I shouldn't say major, a noticeable lack of math skills and literacy skills that are kind of combined. So we get a lot of students who have the ability to do math and they're actually quite good at it when it's just numbers. But once you get into, say, word problems or a more in-depth comprehension type question, that's when things really become challenging for them. There's a variety of reasons for that, but we do see, low literacy skills sometimes on some of our testing. So that's one of the main focuses for us, even in the math side of things. The other thing we do is when we have students coming in, so when they are interested in a program here, one of the first things we do is ask them for their high school transcript. It's not enough just to get their diploma. We found that without looking at the transcript, we don't really have an idea of their math background. So I don't know at your institutes if you guys get that information, but if you do, it's really, it's vital to figure out what the best plan of action is for each student. And what I said here is the high school transcripts do not always match the student's true abilities. So what we've also found is that sometimes students may have all the proper credits and everything else, but they just don't have the math skills that you would expect. And also vice versa. Sometimes we have people that have what we'd call very weak transcripts with not too much on there, but they're math whizzes. So it's not always a true indication, but it's a good starting point as a facilitator or a teacher to know where your students are at. The other thing we've come across is that to graduate from high school, you only need 3 math credits, which to some students, that's a thrill because they don't have to take math in grade 12. They find that really the easiest route out. But the problem is making that decision as a teenager then comes back to bite you as an adult when you might need that for some kind of prerequisite for a post-secondary or a career. So we see a lot of students that take the minimum. They just take the grade 11 and skip over grade 12 math because it's not required. The other issue we see sometimes, or actually quite often, is mathematics for work and everyday life. So this is what's called the workplace level. I'll bring up a slide in a second that'll do a little better illustration of this, but it is the, I guess, the lower level of math. So when you take math in high school, there are kind of three levels when you get into the grade 11 and 12 range. You've got workplace, you've got college, and then university. So what people tend to do is they take the path of least resistance. Right? If they're not interested in math or have issues with math and the anxiety that goes with it, they tend to take the easiest route and take the easier classes that might come back to be an issue later on. So these courses are fine. They do count for graduation and their diploma, but we've found a lot of times, especially with the skilled trades, that they are not being accepted on their applications because they don't have the college or university level math. So it's one of those things that different guidance counselors and stuff are not necessarily explaining to students. And it's great to get them the diploma. That's always a goal, but you have to get the requirements you're going to need for later on. The other thing we do quite often is deal with mature students. So we have some students that come back to upgrade their skills in their 60s and 70s. I've had that quite often. And it's really rewarding as a teacher to be able to help those students and get them to where they want to be. But that comes with its own challenges. They may have been out of school for decades and things have changed, or they didn't have those kind of math skills. So that's something we always work on. The other thing that the main focus of this webinar is anxiety. So math and especially testing, right? Once I say the word test to a student, sometimes you can just see them start to cringe, right? It's a very common thing that we see, especially with someone that's coming back to, kind of start from the fundamentals. Their main issue throughout school has been, their anxiety with math. So when you go over all of this, things you need like to get a high school graduation is you need 30 credits. So we deal with different scenarios for those students. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the kind of pathways for the Ontario math, but there's been a major change. So if you were familiar with this in previous years, you'd notice that in grade 9 and, in grade 9, there used to be an applied and an academic level, just like you see in the grade 10. So it goes locally developed, then applied, then academic. There's been a major change, just like last month, they started de-streaming grade 9 math. So what that means is there are no more choices between applied and academic for grade 9 students. And instead they're taking one kind of central focus, grade 9 math. Now that's something that's been done in other regions and ahead of Ontario, but they're making this decision based on the fact that they found evidence that a lot of marginalized students were being kind of placed and applied and then kind of stuck there. It can be challenging to go from the, say, lower level and elevate yourself up into the college or university level later on if you start in, say, the applied level. So they've changed that now, and it's a major difference. They haven't yet decided on grade 10, and it hasn't been publicized yet. That may be something coming down the line, but as of right now, there are no plans to de-stream grade 10. I'm not sure how this will play out. It's kind of going to be very interesting to see how this works, because students do come out of grade 8 or elementary level into grade 9. It's a very big jump, especially just at the different way that schooling is done when you get to high school. So we'll see how this works out. Hope all for the best. And this gives students a chance to jump up into the academic in grade 10, because that can be it was a major hurdle before to go from applied to academic. Also, students before used to be able to jump from grade 10 applied up into the college or the university mixed course. So if you see on that diagram, in the grade 11, there is the functions and applications university/college. So that one is kind of for both streams. And that jump can be kind of challenging for students coming out of the applied level. They get kind of overwhelmed sometimes by that jump in difficulty. The other thing too is the locally developed to the top of your diagram there. You get into the math for work and everyday life, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. So the MEL 3E and the MEL 4E. So those are the workplace level courses, and they're great because they get you your diploma and your credits you require, but they're not always what you need to actually get into some of the more skilled trades and some of the other post-secondary programs. Sometimes I don't think that's fully explained to students, and they kind of get pigeonholed into that stream. There is no easy way to jump out of that one, because even if you notice with this new system, you can actually jump from grade 9 math, so the generalized one now, straight into grade 11 workplace. You can skip the grade 10 course altogether because there isn't much of a leap there. So it's inviting for students as an easy route, but that can be a detriment to them in the long term. I always encourage students to kind of take the more difficult path, and they may struggle with it, but getting those credits and going through that stream, at least they have the option to stay in that level and go towards the university stream if they wish to. All right, so one of the main things that we focused on and we've kind of changed here is doing diagnostic assessments. So if we have students coming in that want to get into the trades or some college program, and they may need some academic upgrading, first thing we do is ask for a transcript, right? Talk to the students, figure out what their plans are, what they want to achieve, right? And do a diagnostic assessment on. Now, you can gear this to whatever kind of course they're going into. We tend to use the GED assessment just because it's very generalized and it covers multiple different topics and different subject matters. But we also focus a lot on math and literacy. So if someone is interested in taking a trade or doing the academic side of things, like say a program like accounting or some other more difficult college program that involves math, we'll actually include an additional math test that goes along with it to see where the strengths and weaknesses are. Are they ready for that program? And if not, we can get them on the proper path to get them working on some kind of program to, elevate their skills. Nothing worse than having a student start a program that they're not prepared for, and then getting discouraged. We've even found some pretty startling results. So you'll see there it says GD Math, 27% pass rate. So that was from a couple years ago, but it was based on about 300 students that we had come through our doors. These are all variety of ages, so all adults from 18 to whatever age. And it wasn't just for the math programs, but this is for everyone. And only 27% of the incoming students were able to pass the GED math assessment, which, to give you kind of an indication, is about grade 10 level math. So it's kind of stark reality there that math is definitely a weakness for a lot of people. And it's one of those things that it's objective. So math is either right or it's wrong. So you can't kind of fake your way through it. So it's one of those fundamental things that we have to work on. That's why we've added so many programs to help people with that. To go along with this anxiety stuff, having these assessments can sometimes be a source of anxiety for people. So we do get some kind of pushback from incoming students that don't want to take the assessment. No one wants to take a math test. It's not really a thing that people jump up for. But getting the information from it can really help us as educators figure out, where the weaknesses are, what they're kind of scoring like, how they're comparable to other students we've seen and the ones that have been successful, and kind of gives us a, preemptively identifying trouble areas. So the other thing too is we're kind of at an advantage where we're not a massive school with thousands of students, so we can actually meet with the students as well. You'll find more information from just talking to somebody, right, than just doing a test. Could be a bad day for them too, and right, a lot of these students haven't done math in years or decades, so you're not expecting amazing results. But when you really sit down and talk to these students, you get a better idea of how they feel about math, what their actual plans are they taking the right stream of things. And it gives you a real, like I said there, a head start for your lesson planning and your differentiated instruction. So if you are running a full math program or full math class, you can really see, okay, these are the certain topics that are going to be more challenging, or these are a couple students that might struggle with certain things. How can we teach in a very different style for them, and what can we do to accommodate them and give them other resources and ways of learning? So diagnostics are huge. Yeah, assessment is key even throughout the teaching process, but at the very beginning, it gives you guys as educators a huge starting block. It's frozen. Oh, sorry, I don't know why my computer froze there. So just to give you an idea of some of the generalized students that we do see, these are very general, okay? There are obviously exceptions to these groups, but there are 6 kind of general types of students that we see. So the first one would be no diploma and no GED. So they don't have the 30 credits required. This could be for a variety of reasons. So it is more common though with older students. And there's some options for them. They can do PLAR assessments and get some maturity credits, get towards their high school. Or the easier, or not say easier, but the quicker method is usually doing the GED. Once they have the GED test completed and passed, they can then take credits to kind of get the finalized requirements they need. The next is students that are close to having their diploma. So we get some students that think that they're really far away from graduating. They're like, oh, it would take me years to graduate. But then we find out when we get their transcript, they're missing 1 or 2 credits. And that's it. They can take those 2 math credits with us and they're done. It's hugely rewarding to them. So you got to meet with the students and see what they say about their credentials, but really verify it. It's best to actually contact the school that just gave out the transcript and make sure you talk with the secretary to see if that's the most up-to-date transcript. We've been surprised before, finding out they actually have more credits than we thought. So there can be some good things to that. Next would be they have their diploma, but they have the workplace credits that I mentioned earlier. These students tend to have some weaker math skills, not always, but they tend to. They don't usually score too well on the assessment. So what we tend to do for them is we get them to take the grade 11 college level. And they would probably take the basic level before that, just to get some of that fundamentals out of the way. Next, they have their diploma, but with lower grades. So one of the issues we see with the Ontario system is that 50% can be a pass in any class, which sometimes can be almost gifted to students, which is good and bad. Gets them the credit, but at the same time, it's kind of not preparing them for the future as well. So these students tend to have low assessment scores when we test them, but it's not always a bad thing. Sometimes they're just students that just weren't interested in school or in high school, right? They were, teens, right? They weren't interested in what they were doing then. So I've had a lot of success with these students where they might retake a course they already had passed with, say, a 50, and they do really well, get an A possibly. Right? So you can't always go by the transcript. So a lot of those students sometimes kind of get the credit without being fully aware of the content they needed to know. GED students. Now, GED tends to get a kind of, negative connotation to it, which it really shouldn't. It is high school equivalency and seen by most places as equivalent. The other thing too with the GED is you have to pass the test on your own. There's no being gifted the credits. We've seen students fail by one question before. So if someone has their GED, they've actually earned that GED, and they have to do that in 5, categories. We do then require them to take the grade 11 and 12 math, because that's kind of the route they'll need. It is equivalent to about grade 10, but they tend to do really well in the programs and are quick learners because they were able to pass that test, which in reality, most people wouldn't have an easy time with. And lastly, we have people with their high school diploma with very high grades, right? Or good grades. These students tend to do really well and kind of are like your best students. The only time we don't see success with these types of students, if it's an effort level thing or some kind of attendance or some other extenuating circumstance. All right, so I've got some questions for you now. So our topic is kind of on anxiety. So I just want you guys to think and maybe put in the comments, the chat, just some of your general thoughts on teaching math. So I know not everyone is a math expert, right? So what are your thoughts on teaching math? Is mathematics one of your strengths? So it's a kind of yes or no. Do you or have you ever suffered from math anxiety? So people are usually pretty quick to say like they just hate math. They just don't do math. So it's kind of one of those easy scapegoat things. And lastly, are there specific math topics that you find stressful, and what are they? So you don't have to answer all these questions, just kind of add some stuff to the chat. Nice, right away, yeah, math is my weakness, right? That's a common thing for students to say. So in a class of 10 people that I have coming in, I would say 80 to 90% say right away, math is like their definite weakest skill. All right, so I'm just reading through some of the comments here. It seems like math tends to be kind of polarizing. Can be your biggest weakness as opposed to like some people love teaching it. Seeing the content my oldest son was working on in high school was an eye-opener. Yeah, so I've actually had quite a few parents come as students, and they're merely in the class to be able to help their child. Some math has become quite advanced in the lower grades now. And people just want to help, right?
So Shannon says math is my biggest weakness, always has been. I was an applied math student in high school, and Julie said, I feel my personal math skills are fairly average. Seeing the content my oldest son is working on in high school was an eye opener. And Jacqueline, I enjoy teaching math basics. I wouldn't say it's a strength necessarily, but it isn't a weakness. And Maggie, math is usually stressful, but the moment you catch on or find good tricks to solving problems, it can be fun. And Julie talks about, I was good in math. I took it in college for architectural tech.
Yeah, so it's good to see that someone actually found math fun. And that's kind of, it's always one of those things, right? That people just kind of dread usually math. Because it's right or wrong. Math isn't one of those things you can kind of fake your way through. It's not a subjective subject. So even like, for example, I love math, obviously teaching it for years, but I also found it kind of natural. So I've never really dealt too much with the anxiety that comes with it, but I do see it a lot in students. And even when I talked to my wife, who was the exact opposite, she would, write papers and take English and all that sort of stuff all day, which I would dread. But she got through math as quick as possible and stopped doing it. So. Yeah, and it does a lot of it depends on your educator, right? It all depends on how they teach it, how good they connect with their students, right? And make it fun. That's the key. So those are some of the things we're gonna talk about. So math anxiety, is it real? So I've heard before from many people that, oh, it's just, it's not real anxiety. It's one of those things that just, people just don't like math, right? Not liking math is definitely not the same as having anxiety about it. Anxiety is where it becomes the point where it can almost become debilitating, where you literally freeze right up. I've observed this with many students. So I've had students that are doing amazing in class, working on their projects, asking questions, really grasping the concept. And then you say the word test, or you hand them some kind of assessment, and you just see it in their face. They just, it's like they saw a ghost. And I've had students before where they took like an exam and just wrote almost nothing on it, where they just couldn't function. And they had to, talk to them and take a break, that sort of thing. So there's a couple strategies we'll talk about, but it is definitely a real thing. And I've done some research on it, and I found that, was it 50% of Americans have some sort of math anxiety, which should be applicable to all populations. It tends to also be more common with women, not sure why. And that they did a study on, I think it was over 10% of college students had like almost debilitating math anxiety, to the point where they would literally avoid all math courses. So as an educator, you have to look for some of these indicators. And this starts by meeting with the student at the very beginning, right? Getting to know them. Excuse me. Yeah, this was a comment that was saying about oral testing. Yeah, that's definitely like differentiate it and try other methods, right? Because it's not all about just writing a normal, traditional test. It's that's not always the best way to evaluate people. It just happens to be the quickest and easiest. So there are other methods, definitely. So as indicators, uncharacteristic behavior. So you might have a student that's very, very bubbly, lively, really into the math. And then once there's some kind of topic they're not interested in, or something that they just, cannot grasp, their mood and everything just totally changes. So that can be a real indication of some anxiety. Defeatism, which I see pretty often, where just giving up, right? Just accepting, throwing the white flag up, saying, okay, math's not for me. I'm not doing this. And it's like, well, we can get through it. The other thing is permanency. So students get this belief that they're bad at math and they will always be bad at math. And it's kind of I think it's an overused statement by some students, just because it's easy to say that, but for some it is definitely real. And this all comes from a lack of confidence, right? if you didn't grasp some of the fundamentals early on, it became kind of a thing you just cringed about the whole way through your education. The word math itself just gives anxiety and sometimes severe panic. It's something you can see on the students' faces. So getting to know your students and knowing what they're normally like, right, as people and how they interact with you and everything else will help you a lot to identify this. Because you're there just to help them through it. Give them some positive things to do, some examples, some strategies. There's a whole bunch of options for us. But it is mostly to do with, I saw with testing. Students can be just fine when you're learning the material, answering back and forth, it's all perfect. And then once that kind of assessment or evaluation gets thrown in, that's when this all kicks in. So it is good to do differentiated instruction and try other methods of assessment.
Jacqueline said that she sees a lot of students that have that anxiety, I guess.
Yeah, it's very prevalent. Like I've had some classes where I'd say most of the students are dealing with some kind of anxiety with math. And that's where going back to basics, really helps a lot. The other thing too that was mentioned too is math can be fun, right? You're gonna make mistakes. It's gonna happen. It's how you learn. If you don't make mistakes, you're not learning at all. And that goes for anyone, even students or adults or educators that are really good at math. Simple things like doing games. So there's one I use quite often. It's called, I don't know if anyone else has used it, called Kahoot. So almost all students have cell phones now. So what you can do is set up a game, almost like a Jeopardy game on the board, right, or on your whiteboard or your smartboard, whatever you're using, and you can actually make assessment fun. You can make it competitive, and even the students that are kind of weaker, that you would think might be intimidated by, answering questions and competing with their peers, they tend to actually really open up and like it. So it kind of is counterintuitive that way. So making things fun is a great way to just block out the anxiety. They're not sitting there with a test in front of them by themselves, worried about it the whole time. Like I said before, building rapport with your students. So the better you get to know them, the more they'll trust you, the more they'll, give you feedback on things they're struggling with and what helps them. The other thing too is any student is going to gain some success, right? They can start from a very low level, but you can even bring that up and talk about like, here's where you were even a couple of weeks ago to here's what you can do. So I always find it amazing, even at 1 week, a question at the end, I'll always bring up on the board as some, really complicated thing that they're actually able to do and ask them, okay, a week ago, what would you have done if you saw this question? And most of them said they would just not even try it. They wouldn't even know what to start with. So there's always some sort of success you can bring up to help them get over that anxiety. The other major strategy I use is making my own mistakes. So some of these are on purpose, some of these aren't, just how it happens to go. That's why I do a lot of questions on the board that I'm doing demonstrations with that I might not have, have written out for myself. So I might make a mistake in it. This gives students the chance to identify those mistakes. That's a good way for them to learn, to see, identify, okay, where in this question did he go wrong? And also to let them know that everyone's going to make mistakes. There's no perfect math teacher out there. The only downside of this is that you don't want to overplay this card because then you kind of lose credibility. So you do have to be, fairly strong at math. You don't want to be making mistakes on every example, but it is good to actually, just relatable is the best way to say it.
Denise said that she keeps explanations short and sweet and don't overcomplicate. And incremental demonstrations often work well for her learners.
Yeah, like the worst thing you can do with a difficult math topic is to try and just force feed the entire thing at once. That's not going to work for anybody. Maybe one student in the class will get the whole thing all at once. It's not going to work out for anyone else. So that's actually this next slide. So what helps, right, with this is don't overwhelm. The worst thing we do with math is teach for an hour straight of just the same topic and don't get any feedback, don't do any activities, just teach from the board, or give gigantic questions. It's best to chunk this stuff down into manageable, digestible pieces. You have to see how the students react, how they gain the knowledge throughout these little individual chunks before you build it up to being the full topic. The worst thing you can do, especially with math, is try and, do too much at once. Michelle, we were even talking about how like giving out worksheets instead of a full textbook, right? How that can be very daunting to a student to see like, oh man, I have to get through this entire book in the next, so many weeks. And that's not how you want them to look at it. You want students to work at their own pace on things that are, possible for them. And this comes around with a positive learning environment, right? If you show your enthusiasm about math, they're going to gain some of that as well. They might not love math as much as you do. That's definitely not going to happen all the time. But if you show a positive attitude, if you show interest in something like math, it's a better chance that they'll latch onto that and attain those skills as well. The other thing too is working through difficult questions. It can be a group project, right? It can be something you can demonstrate a couple of them on the board, have the students kind of give you guidance as you go through the question. Because you're going to have students that are, more advanced, less advanced, that sort of thing. So using even things like I put on there, think, pair, share. So if anyone hasn't used that, that's a strategy I use every day in math. So you propose a question, you get them all to think individually about something and try and solve it themselves. Sometimes past, you let them pair up in groups or in pairs, and then share their knowledge with the class and actually get through the question. It becomes less intimidating for people because they know there will be assistance along the way and they can kind of bounce their ideas off each other. So another source besides testing that I see a lot of anxiety with and a lot of challenges for math students is word problems. So I mentioned earlier how literacy can be a major obstacle for some people, and it's one of a weakness we see quite often. That lends itself to word problems. So some students do really well when it's just numbers and they're doing operations and doing algebra or doing whatever it happens to be. But once you throw a word problem in there, it just becomes a completely different thing to them. So there's some things you can do. You can build confidence early, and what I mean by that is start with easier questions. Don't assign the hardest question in the book right off the hop. You have to ensure that students have the tools. So you have to go and do those fundamental math skills. I get students that they're taking grade 12 university level functions or something really advanced, yet they rely entirely on a calculator and can't do simple fractions. So I'll actually take the time and stop them for a second and just get them back to the basics before we move on to actually, trying to solve a complicated word problem. Creating visuals. So especially in things that are like geometry or shapes, that sort of stuff, trigonometry, is getting a student to take that word problem and transform it into some kind of drawing that they can understand. A lot of students do much better when they can see the problem instead of trying to wordsmith it through. The other thing to teach and identify keywords. So even simple words like sum and difference, product, what those actually mean in math. So I provide a lot of students with a whole list of math terms that they're going to see in questions, so they can actually reference it as they go through and work through it. And eventually they stop using it because they have actually learned that stuff. The other thing too is don't just put word problems on tests. This should be something you tackle all the time. So frequently giving out word problems and doing them on the board as well. A lot of teachers make the mistake of just doing the operational examples on the board and letting students kind of figure word problems out on their own, which is almost impossible. We already mentioned small pieces and even checking your answers. So once they get answers to questions, they can then work in reverse, maybe doing the algebra or whatever wasn't needed to do it, and actually practicing that in reverse to see, okay, where did they come up with this question? And if it's right or where they may have gone wrong. So on the left there, I got the cubes kind of set up. So there are plenty of these out there. You can use whatever works for you. So this one here, the cubes, it all stands for just different steps you would do in tackling a word problem. You want to break it into little pieces. So circling the numbers, underlining the question, box the keywords, eliminate what you don't need, and does your answer make sense? So that last one, the S, is the one I always, reiterate all the time. Is I even tell students before they try and tackle the problem. So they read the question a couple of times, and I always get them to write down an estimate of what they think the answer should be, or even a range that they would expect it to be in. So then when they're done, they find out, is their answer anywhere near what they expected? And where did they go wrong along the way? Too many students just jump into actually doing the algebra or doing the geometry, not actually thinking about what's involved. So I've already mentioned back to basics, but it's so important, especially with adult learners. And I even see a lot, like I mentioned, with higher level high school students, is they lack the basic skills, the rote learning, the mental math. Like the number of students I now see that cannot do multiplication tables in their head. A lot of them too can't even use a multiplication table when they're provided with one, because they've just avoided it as much as possible using calculators and that sort of thing. And I'm not anti-calculator. It's definitely a thing you need to have and a skill you need to have, especially when you need to more advanced math and to save that much time. But I find a lot of students don't even properly know how to use a calculator because they don't know the proper operations and the mental kind of fundamentals behind it. So you really got to go back. It takes time, right? Obviously, you want to get through the material as efficiently as possible. But there's not much point if they don't really grasp the basics. This is where I use a lot of worksheets. And like I mentioned before, instead of giving a full textbook or thing like that, is doing repetition. I even provide students with like flashcards, things like that. It might seem really remedial, but it works for them. And even the multiplication table, I'll give my advanced students a full 30 by 30 multiplication table that once in a while they'll use. I tell them right away, I don't know my multiplication tables up, so crazy numbers like that. So neither do you, right? So, but they start using it less and less. And it's just there early on as a little bit of a resource, and they use it, it kind of peters away. So we got a comment there saying, I don't even think they use multiplication table in elementary school anymore. Yeah, it's one of those things that it should be fundamental, but it doesn't seem to be getting used as much as it should. The other really common one I see issues with is fractions. They are taught, but not to the level that they used to be, I believe. And it's a major obstacle when students get to more advanced math, where the fraction work is kind of super important in those giant algebra questions or trig or whatever it happens to be. And if they just struggle with that, they're going to really struggle with the more advanced concepts. So the other thing I use for people is, it's not about making math easier, but letting students kind of pick the method they like to use. So for a lot of math, there are multiple ways to get the answer. Some are more efficient than others. And I don't like teaching specific tricks for things, because if I teach just tricks, they don't actually know how the question was working. But I do provide multiple routes to get to an answer. So I've just provided one on the screen here. This is just for dividing fractions, which I would say most students coming in would struggle with just because they haven't done it in such a long time. It's not that the math is hard, it's just there's certain rules you have to follow. Right? So in the one method here, you do what would probably be the traditional way, where you don't really divide with the fractions, you flip your second fraction and change it to multiplication. That's probably the way most people were taught this in elementary school, right? And you do get the same answer in the end, 1 1/5. But that may not make sense to most people. And if you forget that rule, the flipping and multiplying, the reciprocal thing, then it's nearly impossible. So there's other methods. So you can use a common denominator method for doing the same thing, where you make the numbers the same on the bottom, and then you don't have to change it to multiplication. You can simply turn it into 12 divided by 10 and reduce. So there's many, many ways to get answers, even when you get into the more advanced maths. I've been tutoring with students that doing like advanced trigonometry and functions, and there's several different ways to get answers sometimes. As long as you're not making mistakes along the way, that's all I tell them. As long as your fundamentals are strong, you will get to the answer. Another thing I incorporate a lot and found really good success with is using kind of hands-on, they call them math manipulatives. So just getting students outside, getting students doing something besides just textbook and paper, pencil, calculator type stuff. Even if you're teaching something like probability, you can use playing cards, dice, make a game out of things, right? Tracking, rolling dice, that sort of thing. Getting them to really understand what does probability even mean, right? What is it? What's theoretical? What's practical? That sort of thing. Another thing I find a lot of success with is doing manipulatives with fractions and algebra tiles. It really clicks for a lot of students when you take it away from the textbook and lecture style methods and actually get them to play around with manipulatives and actually seeing how it works. And because we do a lot with trades, I even bring things like socket sets and wrenches and things like that in and get students to order them, right? Scramble them all up, try and order them. It even gets them to think about reducing fractions and things like that. And I always ask students when they do the trades courses is ask everyone, okay, who can use a tape measure? And almost everyone puts their hand up and says they're like an expert at it. We do a little activity on it and find out that very few actually do know how to properly use it. So we do activities simply as I cut a bunch of pieces of structural lumber up. I know the measurements for each one of them, and I hand them out and distribute them around the room, and everyone gets to measure them and compare their results. So it's just making things fun. Oh, I'm got a hand raised. Oh, someone had their hand up. Does that work on this?
I don't see it. Oh, Julie, she has a question.
Oh.
Is it best to teach both measurement, metric, and imperial when using a tape?
Yes. So it all depends on what they're doing. So, and it's one of those things we have to know both. What I would do first is have them introduced to like actually the two systems and then try and tackle the tape measure stuff. And I even use a lot of tape measures that have both on them. So we have a called cheater tape sometimes, where they even have the specific fractions on them. So it's a kind of a beginner setup. That works really well. And I'll even put on the board like an inch broken into its little pieces, because imperial is one of those things that isn't being taught as much as it should be, even though it's really still prevalent, especially in the trades. That's why I tell people you're not going to go to Home Depot and order things in meters. You won't know what you're talking about. So you do have to definitely know both. And like I says in here, some of these activities will seem remedial, but you can make it fun, and it'll make things stick. The other key thing that goes along with this too is making this applicable to the real world. So one thing I do is on there right now is the inclinometer, or inclinometer, however you want to say it. So this is for teaching trigonometry, geometry, that sort of thing. So we can actually very simply follow these instructions and make one of these little tools. And you can do your own with, a protractor and a straw, whatever material you have. And you can take these projects and go outside and start measuring things, right? Students prefer to see the real world application of things. if they just see stuff on the board in the textbook, it doesn't really matter to them. But when you take them outside and you can say, how tall is this building? And they can actually calculate it with their observations and with their tools they've learned, then it actually starts to make sense to them. They see why it's important. It also works for their anxiety because they get out of the classroom, they get out of that zone where they dread being, get them outside, get them forgetting about the anxiety of the math and what they do and don't know. And the hands-on stuff really does help overcome that. Also too, as a teacher, it's just way more fun. I personally don't want to be staying at the front of the room teaching or doing textbook work all the time. So it's much more fun to go outside, and it's fun even to create these lessons, right? Get creative. It just re-sparks your interest in teaching math. So there's definite advantages to adult education. So I get asked all the time if I go back to teaching, elementary or high school, and I say no. Adult education is great because you get to use some of these topics that you have to teach, especially in the grade 11 and 12 curriculum, and it's applicable to them. So let's say in grade 12 math and college level, you teach about mortgages. I don't know many students that are 17 years old that really care about how a mortgage works, right? It's something they definitely should be taught because it's going to be a real skill they need down the road, but we find it a lot more applicable to adults who are actually in that market right now. So you get an assignment or a question like this one on the slide here that can be super intimidating to somebody. But when you break it down into little pieces and you actually make it applicable with, money and rates and all that sort of thing, it actually starts to matter to them and they become way more engaged and they buy in, right? They're motivated now to actually learn this material. Whereas sometimes routines, it's just not on their radar. So breaking something down like this can actually make it useful. And because you're dealing with adults, they tend, especially more mature students, tend to have issues with technology. So you can take this kind of stuff and bring it into programs like Excel and showing how to come up with mortgage calculators and investments. So if you invest this amount of money per month for so many years, how much will you have at the end? And it seems really kind of rewarding and interesting because they can actually picture this stuff. So some of the material that's in the curriculum isn't really applicable at the time to teenagers, but with adults, definitely is. And it's great and rewarding too for the teacher because you see results right away with adults. So when someone leaves my, say, grade 12 college program, they might have a career waiting for them at the very end, where you see instantaneous, positive results. So it's great to have that connection with adults and you hear back from them and there's a connection. Even last night, I was a text from a past student asking about loans and interest rates and things like that, a formula just kind of like this, right? And you can help them out with it and they know that they understand it a little bit better. So it's a real rewarding thing for teachers and students. All right, so I just want to kind of go over some resources. You may be familiar with some of these, you may not. These are kind of the ones that I tend to use. There's plenty out there, so do your own research as well on what's out there for technology. So with the whole pandemic, most things were shifted to online, which was a huge, obstacle for a lot of educators. I know on our end, I offer tutoring twice a week, and it's great to do it in person, but during COVID, that wasn't an option. So the first thing I did was get a pen tablet. I don't know if anyone's tried to teach math on the computer with a mouse, especially with a laptop, it can be a nightmare. So getting used to a pen tablet took some time, but was probably the best investment I've ever made. You're able to actually, use a Zoom session or whatever platform you want to use and do lessons and share information and things direct with the student and actually make it legible. Using a mouse was just a complete disaster. The other one is Google Jamboard. So I don't know if anyone uses Google Classroom, but this is something that goes well with it. It's kind of like what you can do with Zoom, doing a lesson, that sort of thing. But you have these Jamboards, which are unlimited, and you can share them with students so that anyone can interact with it. So you give permissions out to, say, a group of students or the whole class or whatever, and they can manipulate things on the Jamboard and do examples and that sort of thing, and get, you see real results. Obviously, you'd have to go over things like proper use of the computer and what you would do on here, but it's another resource that I find works great. So I'll just go over these and I'll maybe show them if you're more interested. So another one is called Desmos. So a lot of students are familiar with it that I've dealt with, and it's a great tool to use. So especially if you're doing graphing, it's got a really good graphing calculator on there, and you can work with the graphs and manipulate them and do things like parabolas and quadratics and manipulations and things like that. It's a great resource. Another one is called Symbo Lab. So this one, students can use it as a way to answer their questions and cheat and that sort of thing. But it's a great resource because you can type in or use a graphing calculator, and you can find solutions to even really complicated questions step by step. Now, there's a free version which doesn't show you all the steps and kind of encourages you to buy it. But when you do buy it, it's fairly reasonable, and it's a great resource for students and teachers. So especially if you're doing something like resource teaching or tutoring, where you're not necessarily prepared for the material every time you meet the student, you can do a quick check on here on a question, and work with the student. I use it all the time for tutoring because I'm not, up to date on every single piece of math all the time. And even in high school, they're getting into some pretty complicated stuff. So just as a resource for teachers, it's awesome because you can go on there and do a couple examples and just get reacquainted with the math concept. And another one is called Khan Academy. So I'm pretty sure a lot of people are familiar with it, but it's a great resource again for students and teachers. So what it is someone was helping their cousin, I believe, or nephew, with doing some tutoring and was using YouTube videos to do it. And what happened was the student did really well, got great help with those videos, and then it kind of just exploded. So that student let his friends know, they started watching that sort of thing, and it just exploded into this whole resource of online instruction. And it's not just math focused. Now, where I've used it a couple times now is what's called a flipped classroom. So this is a kind of a strategy for teaching where it's the complete opposite of what you traditionally do in teaching. So normally you teach a lesson in class, students go home, do homework, you come back and assess them, that sort of thing. This is the exact opposite. So you can use a resource like Khan Academy where students are introduced to the material at home online, right? So they watch the videos, they learn the material, they come to class where you get to work with them one-on-one or in groups or whatever, giving feedback and working on the material to really make sure they fully grasp it, right? And then they can be on their way with that material. So it's completely flipping the concept of classrooms. I've used it a couple of times and it's been very good. It's not something you can do all the time, but it's a neat thing to try out. Just looking at the comments, Khan Academy is a great resource. I also use Math Antics is also really good. Yeah, especially for the fundamentals. And yeah, using the videos in class. So when you're doing lessons in class and you're the same person telling them all the time, you might do a slightly different way than say on the Khan Academy. Something might just click for that student because it was taught a slightly different way. So it's a great resource. And it's not just math, like I mentioned, I'll show it in a second. There's every subject you can think of on there. And I've even used it for my own education for, additional qualifications and that sort of stuff to get myself refreshed on topics. So I'm just going to bring that website up. so can you see the Desmos page now?
Yes.
Okay, so just for anyone that's not familiar with it, Desmos is a great tool. I use it mostly for graphing calculators, like I said. So you go into the resource, you've got a graphing calculator that you can type any kind of formula you want into, and it'll in real time graph it. So you can literally just say some kind of linear graph. So if you just put in 3x, it makes a line plus take 2, and it'll change it in real time. So students can manipulate it, compare graphs, and check their answers, that sort of thing, and get a real-time answer. Also, too, key points, you can just put your mouse over, get intercepts and that sort of thing. The other nice thing on here too that some people aren't familiar with is you can get into some example stuff. So if you're doing, say, grade 11 math, you'd be working a lot with quadratics, right? Or in grade 10. So it comes out with a quadratic, and you can actually on the side here adjust different parameters in that quadratic and get instant results with the graph, moving around, moving side to side, that sort of thing, up and down. So if you're teaching things like vertex form and transformations and all that, it's a great tool. And there's thousands of these things on here, not just for parabolas, but it's one of those things that it's a manipulative that's not, still digital, but it's a great resource. So like the other one I mentioned was Simbo Lab. This one is one I definitely use all the time for tutoring, right? So I have the pro version just because I want to see all the steps. So you can go into solutions. It also does do graphing as well. It has geometry, calculators, all kinds of things. There's even practice questions on here. Let's say I'm doing, I don't know, trig. So I was just tutoring with a student yesterday that was doing something like this. So proving trig identities and that sort of thing. So this kind of question can be insanely complicated and, shocking to a lot of people, especially if you haven't done it in a long time. But this will do is it'll break it down and show step by step of how you got to it. It'll show even the individual steps if you open it up like that. Now, these showing steps will not show up if you don't get the paid subscription, but even without it, it still sometimes will help you just kind of click and you get the information you need so you can help someone learn these topics. And like I said, there's tons of other things on here. It's not just math, there's physics and chemistry and finance and all kinds of other resources on here. And the last one, the Khan Academy. This is probably the most useful one that I use all the time. And the nice thing too is you can set up classrooms on here. So you can assign assignments to students, even if it's just extra resources for somebody. You can make up classrooms and everyone can enroll. The other beauty of it too is that students can make accounts and it tracks how they're doing and will give them scores and medals and all that sort of thing as kind of instant feedback. And there's constant quizzes and things like that too. So say you're doing, so here's the courses available. So it's, like I said, it's extensive. A lot of it is kind of American based, but that's fine. All the way from kindergarten up to advanced university level stuff. So if we're doing, say, I don't know, geometry or something, and we want to do Pythagorean theorem. So we're dealing with triangles. Okay. The way it works is if someone has an account on here, there's practice questions, and a lot of them too. There's even diagnostic assessments at the very beginning, where depending on how they do, they can be exempted from certain topics that they've already mastered. And it'll get them to retry things that they're struggling with. And just to give you kind of an idea how it works, this is what a typical video would look like for a lesson. So anyway.
Here's a question. Do teachers have the ability to review the learner's accounts and progress in Desmos?
I'm not sure about for Desmos. They may, I've never used it for that. I know for Khan Academy, you can definitely track the class. Desmos I've never tried, so I don't want to say yes or no on that. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. But yeah, for the Khan Academy one, this would be a typical lesson. And the nice thing too is this is even a long one for Khan Academy. Most of the time, they're a couple minutes at most. So it's nice and short and digestible. So he does a really good job of breaking things down into manageable pieces and making it understandable for every level. I've seen a lot of resources online where they kind of almost talk above people, and this does definitely not do that. So it's a great resource. And like I said, so you watch the video and then you go on to the practice questions. And then at the end of the unit, there might be a quiz or a test, and it gives you kind of your mastery of all the skills throughout. So I use this a lot with students, not necessarily as assigned courses and things, but as additional resources to get them kind of up to date on the fundamentals. All right, so you should see this slideshow again. All right, so just some final thoughts and tips. With math, you want to focus on the big ideas. Getting too caught up on the small details all the time can just be overwhelming for people. And you got to be adaptable. Having a rigid, lesson plan or template that you have to follow just will not work, especially with adult learners that are coming from so many different levels and abilities. You have to look at the feedback and what do you observe in the classroom? How are the students reacting? What kind of attitudes are you getting? Do they seem confident or not? So there's a lot of times where you will have to go back and review a topic. I know it's hard with all the curriculum you have to cover, but there's not much point in moving on when things just, obviously aren't going well for everyone. Be aware of the endpoints. So the thing that's really good with adult learners is that you usually know their plan and what they want to do in the future. So if it's a specific trade they want to get into, or if it's a certain college program they want to apply for, you usually know that ahead of time. So you can kind of gear their education to that. So you know exactly what they're going to need to get into those programs. So when we do something for a specific trade, we know the skills they're going to have and the skills they're going to need for their aptitude tests and that sort of thing. So we get them ready for the physics and the chemistry and things so that they can go on and be confident in those passing those tests. And like I said the whole time, incorporate hands-on activities. If you make things fun, if you make things practical, students will definitely gravitate towards it. They may not master it perfectly, but it's still something they're going to remember, right? And it helps minimize that anxiety the whole time because they're not focused on individual work with just a textbook. The traditional way of doing math just does not work. The only people that actually works for are the students that barely need your help to begin with. They're just naturally good at math and just makes sense to them. The ones you're going to deal with the most, the ones that are struggling, it's getting them away from those traditional methods and actually doing, some onboard lessons because you have to just to get through the material, but differentiating your instruction, doing activities, making it fun, doing games, that sort of thing. So any questions?
Nicola asked, what are the algebra tiles?
Oh, okay. So algebra tiles are obviously manipulatives you can use. I'll bring them up actually. Because algebra is one of those things that a lot of students are intimidated by because they're somewhat comfortable with, doing math with, numbers. But once you introduce letters and variables into the equation, it kind of throws them. See if I can. I don't want to show a whole video or anything, but no, it goes. Trying to find a good way to explain this. All right, so here's not the actual tiles themselves. Oh, here we are. So they look like this. So I don't know if you can see this or not. So you're breaking the questions down into these tiles. And the way you arrange them, it's kind of a visual for students. So you can understand how X is squared and letters and things like that. It's for some students, it just makes it more complicated. Here's another example here. So if you're doing distribution with, say, 2 factors here, so X plus 3 and X plus 2, you make it into a manipulative. So you have 1X, and then individual here, you have 1, 2, and 3 to make up your X plus 3. On the left, just the other ones. You have X, and you have a 1, you have 2. So when you multiply them, right, you can use tiles in these spots to actually visualize what X times X would actually mean, right? It becomes X squared. X times 1, and you get an X. X times 1, you get an X. And you do all of this, and then you can count up what you have in this whole section here as your final answer. So you just tally it up. It's really good with the tiles because then you can actually, they can move them around and they're not focused too much on, okay, what are the rules of algebra, all that sort of thing. The letters don't scare them as much. Any other questions?
There is, and I can't get it. Okay. Just used another term when I was teaching.
Yeah.
And somebody said, thanks, didn't know they could be used for advanced math. Oh,
yeah. So some of the manipulatives you think would be for, like, you know, elementary level stuff, like grade 1, 2, and 3 can actually be used for more advanced high school things. Because even when I teach the physics class as well, it's a lot of, you know, hands-on assignments and things. That's what they're going to remember. Very few people will remember what's on the board. So.
Well, if there's no other questions, oh, there's another question.
Now everyone's going to be using these tiles.
Well, it's great. Somebody said, thank you. I'm going to look into implementing algebra tiles now too.
Yeah.
I didn't know that either, Paul. I think that's great.
Yeah,
I know that I used to like to use manipulatives in my classrooms.
Yeah, because algebra is just, it seems like a different language to people, right? Because it's just, where do these letters come from? That just is a real roadblock for them. So any way you can kind of get around that and get them to really grasp it is great.
Yeah. So, is there any other questions?
I think that's it.
I guess so. At the very beginning, I wanted to draw your attention to, in the chat, under Sarah's name, she had put up the link for the evaluation for the webinar today. It's very helpful if you complete it. Perhaps Rhonda could put the link up again